Hey everybody, I'm Josh, and I am going in for, I guess, the second culture, the Zodiac of the Gods series. My first episodes were the Greek gods. Part 1 was the Olympian gods, and part 2, the Titans. Because of my previous video on Pharaoh Total War going so well, I figured I would do another episode, this time the Hittites. Not just correlate them to zodiac signs, but also to explain a little bit about these kind of obscure deities. And because they, of all the cultures in the new game Pharaoh, I think are some of the least known, least popular. My background is a bachelor's of science in geography and sociology. I prefer to kind of call it social geography, kind of a mashup of those two. I had all kinds of training in anthropology and archaeology and geology, also social research and such. Essentially, this is a demonstration of some of the work, some of the research I've been doing for a few years now, of correlating deities in cultures throughout the world, using the structure of astrology to kind of represent all the archetypes, all the divine archetypes of the world. And I guess the simplest way to explain it is a kind of Jungian perspective of the archetypes of certain deities and stories. I'm actually working on a oracle deck right now that is exploring those themes, and that should be releasing on Kickstarter within this month of November. So I'll leave a link here whenever that time comes. Also, if you want to support me in my research on mythology and oracle decks and history and games and everything that I do here and everywhere else, you can go directly to my Etsy shop at Studio Pandemonia. We have primarily oracle decks, tarot decks, but we also have candles and all sorts of handicraft stuff too. I forgot to introduce Taters is here. He's just staring at birds and crows flying outside as we speak. This time I've changed mostly two things. One, I'm using Photoshop instead. So this area you see up here, I will be using to drag and drop deities around instead of the tier list website. The second main thing I changed about this video is cusps are in the list. As you can see, that's a lot of signs. That's more than 12. There's 24 there. A cusp sign is in between two other signs. The date ranges for them are not as long. They still have different motifs, different constellations that they refer to. I don't expect everyone to know these, not only because they're quite obscure, but also because me and my partner Callie for Studio Pandemonia have basically invented the names here. Now, cusp signs are not new in astrology, but we gave them constellations and archetypes and write-ups. If you want to explore them, learn them, I'm coming out with a video soon about the cusps, but I also have oracle decks or study deck or guide deck for astrology that I made called the Astral Atlas that you can check out also on Studio Pandemonia. I will not go too deeply into explaining them when I'm placing these deities, but one way you can think of them if you don't know the cusps is they're simply a mix of the two signs next to them. These are not all set in stone. The research that I do is speculative and in many ways artistic. So yeah, with that being said, let's get started. I'm going to reuse a map that I made for the Pharaoh video when I was talking about the Bronze Age collapse, which is the period that the game takes place in. And I was showing many different cultures, as you see here, that were around during that time. The Hittites, as you see now near the center of the screen, originally came from the Balkans and ultimately from the steppe, Eurasian steppe near Ukraine, the homeland of the Yamnaya or Indo-European people. They were the first wave out of the Balkans into Anatolia. And they, alongside the Luwians, were the first Indo-European speakers in really the Middle East. The Hittite pantheon is full of deities that were native to the territories in Anatolia that they were conquering. This map doesn't show it. I will make probably another map showing all of the different mythologies, I suppose, would be a really good map to do in the future. But Hattians, or the Hatti, were the main culture of their central part of Anatolia before the Hittites got there, and I will have multiple deities listed in my slides. Many parentheses in here are going to be Luwian, and Luwian is really to be considered basically the same or very closely related to Hittite. A lot of what I'll be talking about here is going to be part of what is called philology, which is the study of how languages are related. And I look at it from a particularly mythological perspective when I'm looking at deities and how their names and how their themes and archetypes change from culture to culture. So yeah, the Hittites, they were very eclectic. All right, so let's do our first deity of the Hittites. And that would be Tarhuna. Now Tarhuna, his name relates to thunder. Tarhundra, right, is another name for him. Tarhunt is the Luwian name. And then the Hattian storm god is Tarhu. And that's interesting because a lot of Indo-European cultures have the strong presence of a thunder god. For the Greeks, it's Zeus. For the Germans, it's Thor, Thunor in Anglo-Saxon. In Celtic, it's Tyrannus. He's often the king of the gods and something of a representative of their own conquests of non-Indo-European people. But it is not as though the Indo-Europeans were the first to expand the worship of the thunder god. Thunder gods are common throughout the world. All the way into the Americas, they are quite prominent. Deities such as Chak, and in Africa, China, like Raikou or Raiju in Japan. So Tarhu, coming from a culture of the Hattians who is pre-Indo-European. There are all kinds of hypotheses coming about nowadays that the Indo-Europeans were more influenced by ancient Caucasian, Anatolian, and Balkan peoples than previously understood. The most archaic model of the Indo-Europeans is essentially that they came out of nowhere and just started invading everyone with horses and spread their culture and their religion and their language without much resistance or without integrating much of any of the local people's traditions. That's not true. They were certainly fairly warlike. There's no getting around that, really. Established caste systems and hierarchies with themselves at the top quite often. But they integrated many of the deities and languages of the conquered. Tarhuna, as a thunder god, as a storm god, is most associated with Jupiter. Jupiter being the Roman name for Zeus. Jupiter, the planet associated with Sagittarius. In my system, quite often, although not always, a thunder god, a storm god, is associated with Sagittarius. And apart from him being the most popular deity in the pantheon to contemporary scholars, storm deity is often the most popular type of deity in many pantheons. And so it's often easy to start with, to just get our bearings and be like, okay, there's the Sag. Where does everybody else go? And a few of these deities are actually in the game Pharaoh Total War. I'm going to be referring to every deity that's referenced in that game here. But with that, we can head on to the next deity, I think. So Arinna is a Hittite sun goddess, and she has a linguistic relationship with Arinna of the Georgian pantheon, who's also a goddess of light and the sun. Linguistically, Arinna also sounds a little bit related to Ani, which is the Iris sun goddess of light and summer as well. When it comes to the Georgians, they're a Caucasian people, and I mentioned the Hattians as a potentially Caucasian people. She also has a unique role in Hittite mythology as a goddess of royalty and as the queen of the gods, partner of Tarhuna. And that's a very interesting and unique pairing. Perhaps the closest I can see in other mythologies to this motif of the sun goddess being queen of the gods would be Amaterasu in Japanese, although I don't think her partner is a thunder god. In terms of the two coming together in that particular mix, a sun goddess and a storm god, I have not seen it too many places outside of here. Like with the storm gods, many sun gods likewise are Leo, since Leo is explicitly referring to the sun. She also, as you can even see in the art here, there are some motifs at the feet of lion paws, I believe. Lions attending their throne. It's a very common motif during the Bronze Age. So Leo. Probably her closest corollary in other cultures other than Amaterasu might be Sol and Sanna. Sanna is a Germanic. Sol, I believe, is Norse. Moving on to Kurunta, also being the name of the character that I played with within Pharaoh Total War. He's actually a really quite fascinating deity. I really liked him when I researched him. So Kurunta is sort of a natural wild god. He's accompanied by a stag, or sometimes riding a stag, as with this depiction here. And he's sometimes seen as a shepherd. And Runtaya is the name of the Luwian Kurunta, which is really just the same. And I mentioned in the last video that his philology is somewhat related to Rudra of the Hindu pantheon, perhaps an older Indus River Valley deity. He's similar as a shepherd of the forest to Silenus or Silvanus, who's a Roman, Illyrian, Greek sort of wild man god or spirit who accompanied Dionysus to India in the myths, and thus also represents a sort of madness or divine insanity. Or to some degree, he kind of also represents the motifs of Enkidu from the Epic of Gilgamesh. You know, Gilgamesh's best friend who Gilgamesh attempts to civilize. And he was sent by the gods to defeat and usurp Gilgamesh, but they end up becoming friends and wreaking havoc on the world, adventuring across the world. In the Hittite stories in particular, he rebels against Tarhuna, the king. And he does this, from what we understand, to free humanity from the slavery of the gods. Being a wild man means being free and liberating oneself from tyranny and civilization, almost like Pan for that same reason. So there are all kinds of places and motifs that he can fit with. Like Pan and Silenus. Silenus is like Pan. He's actually also a goat man or a satyr, which would correlate him with Capricorn to some degree. It could be something like Virgo as a wild man, representing nature and fertility, and being a shepherd of the forest. But really, in a lot of my research, and to some degree, he is a prime example. I place him in the cusp between Gemini and Cancer, which is Cervus. Cervus representing Monoceros, the unicorn, and Cervus meaning the stag. So quite literally, his representation is in between Gemini and Cancer. Now, Cancer represents, like Artemis, the innocence of wilderness and the protection of that wilderness. Gemini, likewise, is a sign of wanderers and freedom. And so it actually fits quite well in between these two energies. Cervus is also, in our augmented astrology system, a wood sign. Wood being not a pure element, but a compound element or a separate element. So it really fits quite in line with this shepherd of the forest motif. And all these other wild man deities, also the horned god of the Wiccan pantheon, or Cernunnos of Celtic pantheon. So Cervus is my answer. Now there is another aspect of him that I think I would like to differentiate. There's only one Kurunta, but there is Tuwata, which is the specific Hittite warrior form of Kurunta. And part of the reason that I find this unique and interesting is it has less to do with war in the pure sense and more to do with being natural and wild. And so I feel like this motif of Tuwata having to do with war is taking in a bit of a different motif. And linguistically, although this is probably not a proven connection, he sounds a bit like Tyr, the Norse war god who sacrificed his hand to imprison the wolf that was attempting to attack his sheep, his flock. He was a shepherd who turned warrior in order to defend. Similar to this shepherd motif that we see with Kurunta, Tyr is associated with Ares, and Ares itself refers to the god Ares of the Greeks, who is himself a war god, the quintessential war god. But I really like how the motif of Tyr is also a shepherd and a protector. It adds this soft and humble vibe. So now we're moving on to another one of the deities that is mentioned in the Pharaoh Total War game as part of the Hittite pantheon. The game, it says Kumarbi, but Kumarbi is not a Hittite god explicitly. He is throughout Hittite myths. Hittite myths are taken from Hurrian and Hatti myths. The real Hittite equivalent is Ellel, or Enki Nursu, who really is basically an adoption of El, god of the Canaanites, who ultimately goes all the way back to Enlil of the Sumerians. And Enlil in Ellel and El and Kumarbi all represent the sort of grandfather of the gods, the original king, or at least one of the original kings. There's usually one king before him, which is a sky god, who is usurped by him for a lack of competence, let's say, essentially representing that a sky god who's far and away and aloof can't possibly rule the earth because he couldn't get his hands dirty, he couldn't live on the earth, he couldn't ground himself enough. So often there's a sky god who is usurped by a earth god, and usually this dynamic, like in Greek, is between an Aquarius energy and a Capricorn energy. And we can see that in the Roman as the dynamic between Saturn and Uranus. Uranus being associated with Aquarius, Saturn being associated with Capricorn. Uranus being the sky god of the Romans, Saturnus being the earth god of the Romans. Similarly, there is El and Anu, the Hurrian name for Anu. It's kind of funny because there's also the whole joke about Uranus and what it means as a joke. There's a reason, there's many reasons that Uranus sounds like anus. there's a particular myth in Hurrian that I think I'll talk to when we talk about the Hurrians. That is interesting and odd and kind of gross, really. So El is the Chronos to Anu's Uranus. And for that, El belongs in Capricorn. And Ellel, being the Hittite version, basically follows the same story, as does Kumarbi. So Capricorn. So Hanhana is the Hittite Earth Mother. She's associated with cattle as well as with beekeeping, as this particular relief demonstrates. And that's really interesting. I don't see that motif very often either. I believe there's a Hindu goddess associated with bees, and there's a few different goddesses around the world associated with bees. But equating them basically with the queen bee of the earth, like the mother of the earth, is a very interesting motif that I actually don't see very often anywhere else. Similar to kind of Arina, sun goddess thing. They're doing something very unique here. Because it's so unique, it's kind of hard to decide exactly where the bee motif fits into. As a queen, it could resemble Corona here. Corona is the cusp between Leo and Virgo, representing royalty and gold and precious minerals, and it's a metal sign, and luck and fortune. That would make sense. However, there is such a strong motif in many other cultures of the Earth Mother being associated also with cattle, and she is associated with cattle as well. And for that, Hanhana, I think, belongs where Gaia also belongs, and where Earth Mothers often belong, which is in Taurus. And that cattle association being Taurus is the cattle sign. Certainly a very unique and interesting deity in that particular category. Hipatu is another queen deity, or actually this is actually the Luwian pantheons, a horned goddess of royalty representing the throne. Yet another wife of Tarhuna. Hipatu is actually very similar to Hera, representing royalty itself, the throne itself. And there's another goddess Hapantali of the Luwians, who is a shepherd goddess of pastures and of cattle. And then the third name here, Pahilat, is actually a Luwian translation of Balat, who's a Phoenician queen goddess, the partner of Baal. And so, like, Baal being the thunder god of the Phoenicians is very similar to Tarhuna, the thunder god of the Hittites, and Tarhunt or Tarhuns is the thunder god of the Luwians in this case. Tarhuna in Hittite is partnered with Arina, the sun goddess. But Hipatu as a wife of the Luwian Tarhunt actually stems from a Semitic source. Oh, I gotta get you your food, Taters. I'm sorry. So this Semitic, or I guess even larger Afro-Asiatic influence, the Afro-Asiatic set of languages includes Semitic, Egyptian, and Berber languages. And here with Hipatu and Pahalat, they're all referencing the cow goddess of the Afro-Asiatic people. Because the Egyptians have the goddess Hathor. She's also a bull-horned goddess, in the Egyptian case, literally with the head of a cow, who kind of represents royalty and the stability of rulership, which stems back to that sort of Neolithic cattle culture, really. Cattle being a property, but also being a representation not only of wealth, but of power and of prosperity. Even the image I have here for her is taken from Hathor. I couldn't find any specific images for Hipatu. You know, cow head and everything. This is another one I think we gotta put in Taurus. So moving on to another deity that's referenced in Total War Pharaoh. I think the last one that's referenced in Total War Pharaoh, and that is Sauska. Now, Sauska, again, is a Hurrian deity, not a Hittite deity, but often worshipped by the Hittites as well, and many stories taken from the Hurrians mention her, including the story that eventually evolves in Greek into the story of Perseus, and in particular the part of Andromeda being sacrificed to Keto, the sea goddess or the sea monster, I guess. There's an interesting twist on the story that the Hurrians put on that makes Andromeda, in this case Sauska, not so much of a damsel in distress anymore. And that's really interesting. We'll get to that episode. But as for the Hittites, really the closest thing we get to this same motif of Sauska that is related to Ishtar and Inanna and Aphrodite and again Andromeda is Anzili. And Anzili is basically the dawn goddess of beauty and love. Anzili actually resembles a little bit more of the motif of Eos, like the Greek goddess of dawn, who's a little more pure, not really down on the ground, not like this depiction is actually a little too close. This is literally a Sauska depiction, less militaristic, more of an abstract beauty. Dawn goddesses almost always really belong in Libra. And Libra is associated with Venus. So dawn is associated with the dawn star. When the sun comes up over the horizon or just before it comes over the horizon, Venus is ahead of it, poking out above the sun. And so people could look at the horizon and see Venus and say, aha, the sun's coming. So she represents the coming of the new day. That motif is very common in Indo-European mythology. So Libra. And next, let's get to a similar idea, Istanu. Now, I just mentioned Istar, or Ishtar. In this list, we have Istaran, which is the Babylonian counterpart of Ishtar, the male Ishtar, who's also a god of dawn, also of judgment, and often Istaran is a god of justice as well. And so this also definitely hits even before we have to think the motifs of Libra. And being a counterpart with Ishtar essentially means he's probably in the same place Ishtar is. But Istanu is the Hittite version and probably stems directly from Afro-Asian source. Although I am not exactly certain. Estan, the Hatti god, could have actually been the original version of Istanu. Maybe Estan was taken from Istaran in an older, even Sumerian source. There's even a Hungarian deity of the East, Eastern, and East being also associated with the rising sun. And the Hungarians stem from a Uralic source in Ugrian, Finno-Ugrian language and mythology. So it's interesting that this sort of Eastern god, this dawn god, is quite widespread. Now, maybe he got into Hungarian and into the steppe through other Afroasiatic or other sources. Not entirely sure, but what I am sure of is that this is a Libra motif and that this is a quite consistent deity throughout many pantheons. So now we come to Mezulla, another Hittite deity. And this is one of the first pictures I have that I decided to go with an artist. She is possibly related to the Susian Manzat. Susian would be Elamite, so that's around Sumer toward Iran, and they were probably the substrate or like the original people that lived in Iran before Indo-European Iranian influence came in. They're both messenger goddesses of rainbows. And Mezulla is actually the daughter of Tarhuna and Arina, and that's really fitting and interesting. The rainbow is a product of rain and sun, the sun rays passing through the rain and refracting into a rainbow. So I think it's really beautiful and cool to have that sort of mythological interpretation of something physical in the world. Oh, another thing about her is that she's very similar as a messenger goddess and a goddess of rainbows to Iris, who's a Greek goddess of rainbows, who's also a messenger goddess. She's originally the owner of Hermes' staff, the caduceus, before he ends up being the messenger, primary messenger of the gods. She was actually, I think, a messenger of the Titans, which then implies that she came from an older mythology, perhaps something related to the Hittites, perhaps another Hellenic mythology like that of the Mycenaeans or so on, which were related closely to the Anatolian Hittite and Luwian people as well. So as a messenger goddess, she kind of is associated with that Hermetic Geminian energy to some degree. And so it's hard not to see her somewhere in here. And that would be probably an okay placement. But in a lot of my research of multiple mythologies, I came to find that the rainbow goddess best fits within Phoenix here, which is the cusp sign between Aries and Taurus. Phoenix is a sign represented likewise with diversity and color and light, a synthesis of the Aries fire sign motif with the earthy motif of Taurus, creating a kind of transformative, ashy motif as a metal sign. There's also arguments for her being associated somewhat with Sagittarius, being simply a female counterpart of a storm deity. Often rainbow goddesses are associated with rain itself, but because in this case and in many other cases, the rain is more associated with the parent, this case being Tarhuna, I'd say Tarhuna could stay within Sagittarius, and then Leo being associated with Aruna means Phoenix, I think, is a good fit. And this is the Phoenix symbol. Again, all these symbols were designed by us, and they're up to change. Cusp signs, if you look up online for these particular signs, really the only one that is the same from what most people are depicting is Ophiuchus over here in between Scorpio and Sagittarius. Ophiuchus, that symbol is a common symbol. It's one of the only cusp signs that people actually know about. They sometimes call it the 13th sign. The way that we integrate it is having just 12 cusp signs in between everything, so that Ophiuchus is now involved. There's also another sign that they were going to call 13th or 14th sign, which is Cetus, and we put that over here at the end. One Cetus associated deity would be Keto. It's like the sea monster, the sea goddess that comes for Andromeda in the Perseus myth. And in Hurrian, it's Iluyanka, and there's all these different names, Tiamat in Sumerian. That would be associated with Cetus over here. Just a little aside. Now, coming into a next really important deity, I had to censor some of this stuff just because I don't know what YouTube is going to do. At first I was like, whatever, it's art, but I don't really know what their policies are. So Tel sometimes refers to a hill, like Tel Aviv. Actually, the capital or one of the major cities of Israel is actually named Tel after a hill. So Göbekli Tepe is actually, it means hill, and it's somewhat related to that Tele Tepe. But that represents also till. So tilling the soil means, uprooting the soil and getting it ready for a new batch of planting to happen in between seasons. And that's part of what a till or tell as a hill means, is it's a mound that's being built. It's basically mound building with the same techniques of tilling. When you can till, then you can mound build, essentially. And what's interesting about that is that's very agriculture. It's a very agricultural centric deity. He's a deity of fertility and farming. And he's the exalted son of Tarhuna, which is really interesting. There's often a motif of the agricultural god, or the male fertility god, being the favored son of the king of the pantheon. And often that son dies tragically, and is potentially resurrected to show the story of winter, or of a famine or a drought. In the case of Telepinu, he, instead of being hurt or killed by anyone else, he actually just gets really angry, and he decides to just fucking leave and not attend to the fertility of anyone's land. And so all the gods and all the people are just like having this terrible famine, possibly referring to actual famines that happened. And many of the gods are going out to try to find him. They're all trying to search for him. And eventually they get him to come back. And I also referenced Telephus in Greek, and this is actually the depiction of him. They actually have a sculpture of him. I actually just realized that I only censored one of the PPs there, so I guess So Telephus is actually referred to in Homer's Iliad as, I believe, a member, or at least on the side of the Trojans. So, like, that is perhaps an example of when certain mythological figures or deities from other cultures in this case other than Ionian Greek, are treated as personas, or like they're given personas in a story. Now, the Hittites are contemporaneous with the Trojans. Actually, when the Hittite Empire fell, shortly after the Trojan Empire fell, the Hittites fell to the Phrygians, who were invading, and the Trojans fell to the Mycenaeans, who were invading. Many of the Mycenaeans, the Achaeans, might have actually been some of the sea peoples. Ahiawa and the Danaan and all these other sea people groups might have been it. But anyway, I put a question mark on some of these because I'm not certain. I'm just kind of throwing them out there, so I figure if I put a question mark. Telias is a very obscure deity of the Kassite pantheon, and the Kassites were put in power of Babylon by the Hittites after the Hittites conquered Babylon. And the Kassite dynasty had their own deities which resemble deities possibly of Hatti origin. They could also be of Hurrian origin. It's not entirely certain, but since Tilius is such an obscure deity that really has almost no information about it, I made my own kind of philological leap of faith and said, do you think it's Telepinu? This Hittite influence being involved with the Kassites? I figured maybe. Why not? So being an agricultural deity is another one of those motifs in mythology here that quite often places you with Virgo and their aptly named planetary influence of Ceres. Ceres referring to cereal agriculture. He's kind of similar to Osiris of the Egyptians, or even Frey or Balder of the Norse, being the exalted favorite son, having different leitmotifs. Not all cultures are going to distinguish between a fertility deity and a sun deity, since sun often has to do with fertility. Osiris also is somewhat associated with the sun, although a lot of Egyptian deities are associated with the sun because the sun is the symbol, like Arina, of rulership. Ra is considered the sun god, but so is Osiris, and so is Horus, despite the fact that I don't place Osiris or Horus within, in this case, Leo. I would place them in separate things as separate personas, separate deities, and having somewhat separate archetypes. But often the sun is conflated with anything having to do with prosperity or with nation building. In the same sense that people think Leos are all meant to lead. It's not true, but it's certainly mythologically correlated. Since Telepinu is also representative of droughts, in the case of over-sun or overheating, could lead to drought. So moving on to another similar motif, I wanted to cover this deity a little bit. I haven't gotten a chance to talk about it much. I think Khebe also was referenced in the last one where I was talking about Rhea. From what we understand, Kupapa of Sumer was not only a later goddess, but a queen that is said to have reigned for like hundreds of years, which perhaps is a reference to something of her priestesses or particular cult over the Sumerians and other peoples. But there are, as you can see from the art here, many of these carvings really throughout the world of, I guess they call them Venus figurines. This is a much later Neolithic version of the Venus figurines. There are many versions of the Venus figurine that are pre-Neolithic. There's earlier Stone Age figurines. Often the Neolithic one is seated and has, in that case, those are two lions beside her. She represents the throne of civilization, of agricultural civilization. And whereas the Venus figurines are more indicative of the Earth Mother and having to do with birth and the Earth, they are not really associated with Venus, actually. People just call them Venus because I guess they assumed that if there was a female, it was about beauty. Since the Earth Mother is a motif that is shared throughout basically every culture on Earth, it would have been one of the first deities to be carved. And so we find the Venus figurines, which I would rather call Gaia figurines. That being said, there's a bit of a difference here, where it's no longer a pure Earth deity, but it's a cultivation deity, not only associated with grains and farming, but also with domestication and animals. Often these depictions of the seated goddess are shown with many animals around them, even potentially. My hypothesis is that Kupapa goes back to a potentially Natufian or Göbekli Tepe influence of this agricultural coming together, since the Natufian culture of the Levant was the first culture to experiment with farming and agriculture, grains and alcohol and all these different innovations of the Neolithic, being the first, I guess, recasting of the Earth Mother Gaia figurine. Kupapa is associated with Earth Mother, which would be Taurus, but represents more of the grain and the farming aspects of that, kind of similar to Telepinu. And so I place her within Virgo, similar to in Greek, the Titans. I did Rhea and then Demeter for the Olympians, so Virgo. Now, we're not done with this motif. It's such a big motif, and it's so complicated. Now, similar to how the Gaia figurines kind of transformed into this seated agricultural figurine, there are many different deities of Anatolia that are referring to this figurine, queen goddess of the people and of agriculture and of civilization, really. And Khebe is another one of them. Khipa would be the Hurrian version, so perhaps they're getting it from that. But a slightly different take on the word would be the Luwian, which is Nicaragua, which is actually very interesting because it shows a direct sort of influence of Luwian on Ionian Greek or perhaps Aeolian Greek. And Ionian Greek would be the western part of Anatolia, so near Lydia, where many cultures say the Lydian culture, for instance, is often considered a Greek culture, even though it's a Luwian culture. They're so similar and they've mixed so often that it's hard to really distinguish between the two. And the Ionians lived with the Lydians and Carians and Trojans for so long. And the Trojans are an example of an Aeolian culture, most likely. This is an example where Nike, the goddess of victory, was probably loaned from an Aeolian or Ionian or Luwian source. Khebe and Kipa of Hittite and Luwian usually represents essentially the motherland itself. And as a goddess of victory, it's as though the Khebe Kupapa figure is kind of changing hats for a moment to represent, defending the motherland, fighting for the motherland. When it comes to that motif, goddesses of victory is an oddly specific but near universal motif. We find it in so many cultures. I just referenced Nike, who's similar to Victoria. The very name victory stems from this goddess, Victoria being Roman. Even the Norse Valkyrie comes from a similar source to Victoria and is also essentially a goddess of victory, although there are many goddesses, many Valkyries, right? So one might first think, since it's a war goddess, is it Aries? But there's also aspects of the winged Valkyrie, of the state of the motherland, that is kind of Libran, that's related to that Ishtar sort of fighting for the civilization, fighting for the people. Athena is almost similar to some degree, but since Athena is separate from Nike in the Greek pantheon, as a rule, I tend to try to split and try to diversify, try to spread out the deities as much as I can to try to fill up the space so that a story could really be told. Let's say if I wanted to do a story eventually with my synthetic pantheon where Nike and Athena interact, if I wanted them to interact with each other, they would have to be different deities representing at least somewhat different motifs. And for that, we can't do Aries and we can't do Libra alone. But what's interesting is we have Kupapa here. One way that I like to think about it in this context is Kupapa taking on a different persona in a cusp that actualizes more of the social, civilizational aspects of her nature, which I think would be the cusp between Virgo and Libra, which is Corvus. Corvus meaning the crow. I often associate Corvus with dusk, and crows are often associated with dusk. Now, dusk is the opposite of dawn. It's, when day is coming to an end. Venus is not only the morning star, but also the evening star. Goddesses of victory, like with Valkyries, often represent death to some degree. It's a triumphant death, but a death nonetheless. And in many cultures, say in like Egyptian, there is a dusk deity or a dusk goddess that carries the souls of the dead over the horizon toward the setting sun. And the Egyptians, and I think the Berbers also, refer to the far west as being the place where the dead, where dead souls go. And it makes sense for, dawn to represent new life and birth, and for dusk to represent death and afterlife. This also kind of comes into the Lord of the Rings or the Tolkien mythology, where into the west is the Undying Lands, and that's where the dead go. The dead souls go across the ocean into the far west. Corvus. The last of these, I know it's the same picture, will be Malice. Since I skipped over it slightly before, I said, a little bit of Libra, a little bit of Aries, as we have Corvus here and we have Virgo. Perhaps there is a deity, or at least a version of this deity, that is a lot more warlike than simply representing victory and the motherland. Malice, in particular, is the Luwian goddess of wrath, war goddess. And the word malice kind of indicates to you what that means, even in English. Malicious. In the Greek Olympians video I did when I placed Enyo and Bellona in Aries as an aspect of Ishtar, basically. In this case, Ma is also a very vaguely understood motherland deity of the Cappadocians. And the Cappadocians are a bit mysterious. It's referring to a region in near central southern Anatolia that was largely influenced by Hattians, Hittites, Hurrians, and Luwians, just all kinds of influences there. And Ma might be a name that is a later evolution of this Malis and this mother goddess sort of Kupapa figure. Khebe is often associated with Ma as well. And then there's a Kassite deity, again, a question mark, because the Kassites are very mysterious, but there's a linguistic, philological question I have about the relationship of Ma and Malis to Maritas, who is kind of similar to the Hindu deity, perhaps even in this River Valley deity, who's Mara, essentially a goddess of wrath and kind of chaos, chaotic energy. And for this, I finally give it an Aries motif, I think it's fair to say. So here we have Ingalova. She seems to be related to the later Greek deity Angelia. We get the name Angelina, actually. A messenger goddess, either a daughter of Hera or of Hermes, and she was raised by nymphs. And essentially she stole anointments from Hera and gave them to Europa in Minoan Crete. And she was punished for thieving. In order to be purified of her act, she had to go into a lake in the underworld to be cleansed. After this sort of cleansing, she became a chthonic deity. She sort of was associated with the underworld. I guess she never left. But this deity essentially evolves into the word angel, being a sort of messenger spirit, right? The angel means messenger, and she is a messenger goddess, sometimes from the other world, let's say, in this case, the underworld, and in this case, almost a fallen angel. So there's aspects of this that kind of almost resemble Persephone, although Persephone was never considered a messenger goddess, is not explicitly always considered an underworld deity, although she lives there and is taken there. She also returns quite often. To fill in some of the blanks, I learned about another deity in Italic myth, Angitia, who's a goddess of health magic and is associated with serpents. Philologically speaking, as well as mythologically speaking, she's kind of similar to Hygeia, a Greek goddess of health, and again, often associated with serpents. There are many deities where serpents, chthonic serpents, are considered good or helpful. Luckily for us, we have a sign that represents serpentine archetypes, and it just so happens to be a sign that works both as a messenger of knowledge and wisdom, as much as it is an underworld or chthonic deity of going somewhere and getting profound truths. And that will be Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus is the cusp between Scorpio and Sagittarius. Scorpio, it's quite easy to tell. There's a chthonic underworld sort of aspect to Ophiuchus, to serpents. I mean, you see this even in the mythos of Hogwarts with Slytherin. You know, Slytherin doesn't get too deep, really, but there are many motifs of a chthonic water serpent sort of mythos surrounding them. Where Sagittarius comes in is the aspect of wandering wisdom and seeking knowledge, seeking experience. So Ophiuchus, in that sense, in between the Scorpionic and the Sagittarius, represents a shaman who's taking the difficult path of finding wisdom and going into places that other people won't go, adventuring where no one else will go. That is kind of the motif here that I'm sensing with her. That would be very interesting and quite fitting. Ingalova. Alasuwa is a Luwian and Hittite goddess of youth. Somewhat similar. I placed her right after the previous chthonic deity because Alasuwa is also somewhat considered chthonic. Alawani is a Hattian and then later Hittite goddess of the underworld. Alasuwa is associated with the Hurrian Alonzu, and Alawani is associated with the Hurrian Alawani. We have Alasuwa and Alonzu on one side as goddesses of youth, and then we have on the other side Alawani and Alani as goddesses of the underworld. I mentioned Persephone or Cora in the last example. This example is a lot stronger. potentially a goddess that is both a goddess of youth, of everlasting life, and also of the underworld. This paradoxical dynamic of life and death. And I did, I believe, place Persephone in my last Greek video. I put her in Virgo simply because she was a daughter of Demeter. But again, that was kind of breaking my rule of, if there's two characters in a story that are very important, probably keep them separate characters in every story, right? So that they can have an interesting story. Not to say that there's only one Virgo deity. I mean, in my system, I have 3 deities for each sign, including cusp signs. So there's still room for, maybe a elder Virgo versus a younger Virgo. When it comes to my current understanding of Persephone, especially with cusps included this time, unlike last time, I put many goddesses of youth and innocence and harmony, and often they're associated with the first woman motif, like Eve. I put them in the cusp between Taurus and Gemini, which is Cuniculus, the sign of the rabbit. The constellation is Lepus, but Cuniculus is, I guess, another Roman name for the same constellation, just under Orion. There are many rabbit-related deities in many pantheons that are associated with the first woman and with femininity in general. The Greek goddess Harmonia, which I didn't include in my last list, for instance, is one of my favorites. She's a goddess of unity and relates to some degree to Juno, an aspect of Hera that's a bit more unifying. And we talked about in my last Greek video how Juno and unity and Harmonia are all these kind of Geminian potential motifs having to do with communication. Harmonia is something of a counterpart to Hermes, being both deities of harmonization and communication and bringing people together. Hermes having an older form in Triptolemus, who spread civilization and knowledge and farming throughout the Neolithic world. That, in combination with the kind of Hera ideas that we talked about with Hipatu, Cuniculus right in between those two is kind of a perfect place, I think, for Alasuwa, this youthful, harmonious goddess to be. One that also, through harmony, is able to integrate the darkness, is able to integrate the underworld. So, Cuniculus. And here, another similar name is Alawani. It's a Luwian, goddess of the moon, and also of wild animals. The Hurrian equivalent is Inara, because although linguistically these aren't fully related terms, Alawani is the wife of Kurunta, who we already talked about being a god of wilderness, and her, a protector of wilderness, has a lunar Cancer vibe, which is where I put her, right here next to Kurunta, since Cancer is associated with the moon. Most moon goddesses and gods are associated with Cancer in my system. It's not always the case, though. Rabbit on the moon motif is also a thing that's quite common. So Cuniculus sometimes is associated with the moon as well. But the Hurrian version of Kurunta is actually called Inara, and it's just spelled differently. He's essentially, in the Hurrian system, not given his own name in that context. He's simply considered the partner, the counterpart of Inara. So this art here, it doesn't fit with the rest, I know. It's because I couldn't find any art on her. However, this is a fan art, I think, for a particular game that actually has Alawani in it. I don't know if someone was just interested in Luwian mythology or Hittite mythology or something, and they decided to put this name and this character in the story, in the game. I'm not sure, but I thought I would feature it just because I was like, wow, someone actually knows about this deity. Like, they're pretty obscure for sure. In terms of her color scheme, it's definitely more in line with maybe a Virgo. Doesn't really give me a moon goddess vibe to it, but I am also coming in with huge baggage here. As a moon goddess, she's actually very similar to Diana and Artemis, who's not just a moon goddess, but also a goddess of wild animals. She's not as abstract as in the Titan video I had Phoebe and Selene, who are much more identified with the moon far and away, very up in the sky. Still definitely Cancer, but a more elder form. This would be a younger, more grounded form of Cancer that is in the woods, in the wild, defending innocence, essentially. And that's why being coupled with Kurunta is another really good dynamic. There's some good marriages in the Hittite mythology. We have Arma, the Luwian moon god, and he's related perhaps to Men, the moon god of the Phrygians, so that would be more of a Danubian, late Indo-European influenced name. But Armazi, who's a Georgian or Kartvelian Caucasian deity, it's actually very interesting. I will talk more about him and a lot of other deities that he's related to, potentially like Ahura Mazda of the Iranian mythology in that other Caucasian, Georgian, Hattitian video. As for the Luwians and Hittites, he was very important. So important that Armazi in the Georgian mythology is actually the king of the gods there. He represents travel and birth, and he's involved with the birth of people and souls, and also guards oaths. And so there's something more moral and personal about this moon deity that I find really fascinating. He's so fascinating, in fact, that I entertained the possibility for a while of him having something to do with the elder god of Gemini, who has to do with the traveling souls through the underworld, the old man, the Karen, essentially, who represents intelligence and travel in that Mercurian, hermetic kind of way. I had also thought of a similar deity in Egyptian, Khonshu, that I entertained possibly being Geminian rather than Lunarian. But I have since come around to seeing these deities as proper moon deities and properly in Cancer, not quite within the wood sign service kind of vibe that's obviously already represented in Hittite and Luwian with Kurunta quite well. But really, Arma is a powerful influence of masculine Cancer energy, and that's why I place him there. So we're getting near the end here, or in the last row. Aruna is a somewhat obscure Hittite deity. I can't be too sure where he might have actually came from. Maybe he was a native Hittite deity from the Balkans or from Ukraine. I'm not sure, but I have a question mark here for Varuna, and that's a huge stretch, so it almost deserves 2 or 3 question marks. But linguistically, it's very similar to Varuna, the sea and sky god of the Hindus. Now, Varuna was originally a sea god. He later became a sky god, but he was associated with crocodile, and sometimes is portrayed as something of an evil or morally gray, chaotic being. And so I feel like conflating Aruna and Varuna is not too hard to do in this context, especially since Aruna of the Hittites is so obscure and so unwell known. We basically only know that he was a sea god, and that sea gods in nearby pantheons, say the Hurrians, tended to be quite chaotic. Like Chaos, literally chaos. It was the Hurrian god of the sea who wreaked havoc on a lot of the other gods and fought the thunder god of the Hurrian pantheon over dominance. Similar to how in some myths Zeus fights Poseidon over dominance to decide who's going to be king. Sea gods are another one that quite often, most often, is associated with Pisces and with Neptune, right? Neptunus being a Roman sea god himself. And sadly, there's not really much more we can say about it other than that. We get some linguistic basis and we have some thematic basis, but often that's enough to at least place something. And here is one of my favorite deities I've ever really discovered. So Shiwat is the Hittite version of Tiwaz, and Tiwaz is the main name of the Luwian sun god, and seems to resemble Shavini, which we'll mention, and also Shamash, and all these more Akkadian and Semitic sun gods. Sumiji is the Hurrian and Kassite deity, for instance, as well. As for Tiwaz, it gets a little more complicated, because his name actually sounds almost identical to Tiwaz, who's a Germanic deity, basically the same as Tyr, which I mentioned earlier, is similar to Tuwata. But when we're looking at a sun god here, Tyr is almost never associated with the sun, and Tiwaz not so much. So this is an example where there's probably a linguistic coincidence. In many mythologies, each deity has a aspect of their name which basically says God, or sky in this case. T might just relate to D and like Demu and Deus and just the sky. That linguistic motif actually goes back who knows how far, because one of the craziest things is there is a similar deity, a sun god of the Pawnee, Caddoan people native to Nebraska, Kansas area. And it also sounds like Tarawa, which is the Pueblo sun god. So these are linguistic motifs. The Tai and Dai and Da are all very like old sky father type names. And so that's really where Tiwaz, I think, comes from in this Luwian name. Now with Shavini, who's Urartian, whose Urartians are basically the successors to the Hurrians, and then they're the predecessors to the Armenians. And Shavini is a very interesting situation. We'll have to cover him more in the Hurrian, Urartian, Armenian episode. But there's something of him that relates to the linguistics of Shiva as well in the Hindu pantheon, and yet represents this king of the gods, as this picture is showing a really great picture, essentially the atlas of the sun, holding up the sun. Honestly kind of reminds me of the Incan sun god Inti a little bit, at least in the way it's portrayed. Of course, as a sun god, you give a big preference toward Leo, and we don't have a male Leo counterpart in this particular set so far. But the slight exceptions, as we talked about a sky god, we talked about sky father being a relationship. This is where things kind of get complicated. The way I see it, there are often 3 signs that get the sky father motif. Usually Leo, if they're referring to the sun as basically the face of the sky. Aquarius, if they're referring to the sky itself, just the open blue sky. And Sagittarius, if they're referring to a thunder god. Now, there are many deities who have associations with the sun, the blue sky, and with thunder, even if they represent the wide blue sky, like Tengri of the Mongolians or the Turkic peoples. Their voice is thunder. And so there's a sort of a monotheistic bent when it comes to Sky Father. It's part of the reason that the Sky Father is, from a certain point of view, the most worshipped god on Earth, even to this day. So anyway, I think because the solar motif is so strong, I'm going to go with a sun god. So now we got Yarri, and Yarri's an interesting character. He's probably the same or evolved from the Babylonian era and is related directly to the Luwian Shanta or Santa. In each case, he's a god of plague and illness and death. He's usually depicted with a bow that inflicts illness on people. And so he's somewhat of a war god as well as a death god. He is not explicitly always an underworld or chthonic deity. This is often something that occurs in mythology, where there is a death god who is more of a earth roamer, let's say. He hides in the darkness or in the night or in the foggy and scary places of the world, waiting to inflict pain and torment and chaos on people. So in a way, he's kind of like a trickster deity. And there is a particular sign that is most associated with the underworld. So let's start there, or with death. And that would be Scorpio. Now, that he is not explicitly an underworld deity, and that he's not explicitly a king of the underworld, implicates us with a little question of, is he really a Scorpio, or perhaps maybe a cusp of something else? Most likely this death orientation places him somewhere in the cusp of Scorpio, but I'll tell you where I usually put this kind of trickster deity. Lupus. And Lupus is the cusp of Scorpio and Libra. So why Scorpio and Libra, and how do we cusp Scorpio and Libra at all? Well, for one, right now it's actually just after Halloween. We're in November, so we're actually into the Scorpio season right now, and we just ended Lupus transition from Libra. And Halloween is kind of the perfect mood for what Lupus represents. Not simply death, not simply plague or so on, but really trickery. There's a lot of chaotic deities distributed throughout the zodiac, really, and like every, I think, deity has a dark side and a light side, let's say, and is ultimately kind of gray. Lupus is the sign of basically the werewolf or the lone wolf. Has many examples throughout mythologies around the world, related usually to a dog or a dog-related deity of trickery and death. Cerberus, for instance, of Greek, the three-headed hound, is an example of this lupus motif. Coyote of the Southwest and Cascadian, Amerindian mythologies is also similar. There's Kersha and Caucasian, etc., etc. There's many, and Yarri also somewhat resembles to me a wandering death deity that's essentially related to the Indo-European Yimo, Hindu Yama. And there are so many of this particular deity and this particular linguistic philology throughout many mythologies around the world, even making its way into Korean with Yamna, I think his name is. He essentially represents the first person who died. And in that sense, Yimo and Yari kind of represent this deeper connection to our ancestral roots, pay them their due respects. So now we come to Hasameli. There's also not that much we know about Hasameli, but we do know that he's a god of smithing and metalworking. Linguistically, he seems to relate to Hephaestus, Hephaestus having to do with fire and with the forge. Hephaestus actually kind of relates to aphelion. Helion means the sun. Aphelion means farthest from the sun, so aphelion. There's an interesting paradox there where a forge is essentially a sun in the underworld. When it comes to volcanoes and their eruption, you can kind of see how it's almost as though the sun is erupting out of the earth. And really, when you look at solar flares today, we have that sort of magmatic looking form that they take. Plasma kind of resembles lava in a lot of ways. Back in the days of flat earth, say with the Egyptians, Ra and Osiris and Horus in part are associated not only with the sun but also the underworld, because it was perceived that when the sun went over the horizon every day, it would descend into the underworld, bringing light there and, ruling that half of the world at night and then coming back during the day. That is why Horus is given the job of ferrying the dead over the horizon. Osiris, also being associated with resurrection, goes over the horizon into the underworld and then returns every day, is reborn every day. Hasameli might actually have, at least in the second half of his name, Milkuni or Melkart. Melkarth might be related to this, who is the Hurrian and then Phoenician god of smithing. He is probably the linguistic basis for Tolkien's Morgoth, since Morgoth is not just a god of evil and darkness, but also of volcanoes and of the fire of the earth. There's all these, I guess, Catholic sort of satanic motifs involved with it. Conceptually speaking, we have Sauron, who later, in the form of Anatar, gives gifts and crafts as a smith the rings of power. That's enough for me to already place him. There is, like with many of these cusps I've shown, we created to suit a mythological, archetypal full spread of representation. That's part of what this model is. 24 is quite a deep set of archetypal categories. And where I usually put the smithing god or the volcanic god is in the aptly named Vulpecula constellation, the Vulpecula sign, which is a cusp of Sagittarius and Capricorn. Sagittarius being a fire sign representing adventure, wisdom, expansion, kind of mixes very interestingly with Capricorn, the sign of creativity, fortune, and really hard work. So Vulpecula right between those two represents this sort of enterprising, creating, and crafting. And so that fits perfectly within here. Similar to the coyote that we talked about before, since Vulpecula represents the fox, is another kind of trickster. And this kind of trickster sometimes ends up helping people. Prometheus, who gives fire to humankind and is himself a master smith and creator. He's a benevolent force in that sense, but also a trickster. And in many other mythologies, like Amirani in, I think, Georgian, is also a trickster, sort of smithing god that steals fire. And this is a common motif. So Vulpecula, both linguistically related to volcanology, related to Vulcan and volcanic, also to fox and to this trickster motif, actually works quite well for any god of smithing. Peruwa. And as you can see from a connection that I drew here, not only his name, but also some of his themes are related to Perun of Slavic mythology. Is essentially the sky father of the Slavs and is, well, the Sagittarian aspect of the Slavic sky father, which places him here. And the other aspect of Perun and also Tyrannus I mentioned earlier, and also some more obscure deities of, say, Thracian, like Sabazios, is also a god of horses. And this would make sense, since horses were extremely important in Hittite society, as Hittites were some of the first peoples in the Middle East to use horses in warfare. At that point, it was chariot warfare. The Hurrians were also using it, probably even before the Hittites did, at least in my suspicion. Horses were native to the Eurasian steppe and then all the way into much of Europe. For a long time, they were hunted by hunter-gatherers there. Horses were slowly domesticated to the form of horses that we often see today. It was the Indo-Europeans who ultimately spread horsemanship and horses throughout much of the world. Hittites being the first wave, and then Danubians and so on being another wave. So this is probably a few different versions of the same sort of horse deity, who's often also associated with thunder and lightning, solidifying that Sagittarian connection. But Sagittarius being often depicted as a centaur archer. It kind of goes back to a kind of Scythian boogeyman, let's say. A man and a horse becoming one is essentially what a horse-drawing warrior is. There's an aspect of Jupiter that is related to this Peter sort of root, meaning father. But even going further back, the Etruscan deity Vejovis, where we get the word Jove, an alternative name for Jupiter in the Roman mythology, primarily seen as like a young, adventurous, horse-drawn chariot version of Zeus. Zeus might have stemmed from this Zabazios thunder horse conqueror deity that represented basically the Indo-Europeans themselves. We have Tarawa, goddess of birth and children, which is a common motif throughout many mythologies. Taweret is that for the Egyptians. That's the hippo goddess who was portrayed in the recent Marvel show Moon Knight, which I actually enjoyed to some extent. That was actually kind of interesting, and from a mythological perspective, I was just like, aha, look who it is. Whenever they have deities or gods in Marvel, I am usually like, oh god, no, that's not right. Or I'm like, oh wow, that's actually, you're representing me, look at me, my fandom is being represented, which is history, right? Anyway, since we know the Egyptians and Hittites were bordering each other and fought wars against each other often, fighting over rulership of Canaan, possible that some of these names and some of these deities might have been traded back and forth. But it's also possible that there was just a common ancestor in Canaan or in the Tufian Levant civilization that just spread down to Egypt as Tawret and spread up to maybe the Hurrians or the Hattians as Tarawa, and then the Hittites came in, adopted Tarawa, and then run into the Egyptians and said, oh wow, look, we have the same deity. That could have happened too. This portrayal I have here is of Tawret. Again, I couldn't find anything for Tarawa, but Like with the Nike and the Hathor situation, I figured, this is so similar that I might as well just use the same image, as long as I tell you that. As for where I put these kind of birth deities, I actually put them in Cetus. And I mentioned Cetus as being the chaotic sea goddess territory. And there's a reason that the birth goddess is also very much synonymous with the chaotic sea goddess, who, like many other sea mothers and many other mythologies, is one of the first goddesses, one of the first deities in existence, and is often the mother of everyone. And in some other mythologies, say like the Inuit, there is still a sea mother who's very much one of the most prominent goddesses in their pantheon, and that would be Sedna. So, Cetus being sea mother and associated with whales as mammals has this more motherly related sort of theme. And then we get to our final one that I included. There are many other deities that I have not included on here. Not too many more. I mean, from my research, this is actually a majority of Hittite deities that I know of, and even Luwian that I know of. This Pihassassa is Luwian Pegasus. It's literally the name for Pegasus, perhaps that the Greeks got from the Luwians. Another example, like Nicaragua became Nike, this Pihassassa became Pegasus, which again implies perhaps this Perseus myth where Pegasus also is introduced, comes from an older story, more Semitic in origin, or at least more Anatolian or Levantine in origin. But then there's also the Hittite deity that I felt like putting in here with the question mark again, Hahimas, who is a Hittite god of thunderstorms and winter. When we say winter in the Mediterranean or anywhere other than in the frigid north, we don't mean always snow, but in the Mediterranean and in India, for instance, winter really represents the wet season. And the wet season just means there's more storms and there's more rain and more overcast coming in. More moderate climates often represents a thunder god or a storm god to some degree. Now, that being said, there's a particular sign or a particular cusp here that I often put winter deities into. And since some deities are associated with thunderstorms and with winter, it's a choice between Sagittarius and the other one, Pegasus. Pegasus is the cusp between Aquarius and Pisces, and Pegasus is, of course, a constellation, right? Even in Greek myth, Pegasus is given to Zeus as one of his horses in the sky. And Pegasus kind of represents the clouds of the thunderstorm, the fluff of the thunderstorm, which is a good mix between Aquarius on one side and Pisces on the other. Pisces representing water and the kind of chaos of the sea, mixed with Aquarius representing the sky, but with that little mix of water and chaos representing a little bit of storms, a little bit of cold and frigid winter, perhaps. The god Borealis, for instance, in Greek, or really in Thracian, is also, I think, in this motif here. Even monstrous chaos deities like Typhon in Greek, or even Huracan, the namesake of hurricane in Taino, Caribbean, Amerindian mythology, has this sort of Pegasus motif. So Pegasus is Pegasus. I thought I'd finish with that one because I thought it was kind of funny and interesting. And so we have gone through all of them at this point, and it took a little while for sure. It did not take as long, I don't think, as my first video, which I split into two parts. I have no need to split this into two parts because it's not as convenient as Olympians versus Titans. So I would like to do live streams of this kind of thing, to be honest, because it would be really nice if I could do questions and answers, or maybe some other format of just talking about stuff, or maybe I do study this a lot. I have a database I am using, Obsidian. It's like a homemade Wikipedia, basically, and I have an entire database of deities that I'm working through. It's really fun to work on. And honestly, I need some help. So, like, if any of you is interested in this sort of thing, leave a comment. Or maybe we can plan out a live stream, even if it's just one or two of you. If there's anyone else who's a mythologist out here or a historian or is interested in these cultures or other cultures or has something to say, if you have a culture that you're represented from or that you're interested in, if you're a pagan that practices a certain pantheon or other, reach out. I would like to hang out with more people who are interested in this sort of thing. It'd be much more fun to do this if it was more of a question answer format or otherwise like interactive, you know. That being said, we do have a few holes in here. I feel pretty comfortable with this. I feel very comfortable with where all of them went and with where the holes are. I mean, one could argue that Alani, Lelwani or Elani, instead of being canunculus, could be separate and cut from Alasuwa and Alansu and become its own one in Scorpio and being similar to Hela and all these other chthonic, scorpionic deities. There is another more obscure deity that I forgot to mention that actually fits the bill for Kurunta, being a more explicit sort of throne and crown persona of Hipatu. I don't know of any Ursa. This is Ursa right here, deities that would fit here if there were more explicit rain or hunting deities. I don't know. As for Gemini, I told you about how Arma has some Geminian motifs, but like being a moon god kind of can't be associated with Mercury too. So there's like some missing Mercurian energy here. Cygnus, which is what this is, the swan between Capricorn and Aquarius, is also not filled out in here. Yeah, that would be something more like a river god or goddess, and we really didn't see any river gods and goddesses in much of my research for them in particular. There are plenty of Phrygian river gods and goddesses, but I'm not seeing too many here. I don't even know of an Enki or Ea, similar to the Sumerian version in more Anatolian myth. And then we have Aquarius that isn't here. I think there's a deity Acerdus who actually would be the sky god potentially of the Hittites and is basically a translation of Ashur, who's the Assyrian sky god, sky father, very similar to Anu, which I mentioned. Another reason why there's no explicit Hittite sky god is because Anus and Anu are in the stories of many Hittite myths, but they're actually just taken from Hurrian or Sumerian or Babylonian or whatever. So yeah, at that, I think is where I'll leave it. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this or you have any feedback. Did it work for you? Is this an okay format? Is there a better format? What other mythologies would you have me do next? I've mentioned the Armenian, Caucasian, and Danubian, and those would be 3 separate videos. The Nubians would involve the Phrygians, Thracians, Dacians, maybe even a bit of Celtic and Italic. Caucasian would include Hattian, Kaskian, potentially Kassite, then Kartvelian, Georgian, maybe Circassian, and all these other more obscure Caucasian mythologies. And then the Armenian branch would be Hurrian, Urartian, and Armenian. Apart from Hellenic, I mentioned Hellenic. Hellenic would be another branch. I could also do one on Semitic, which would include Phoenician and Canaanite and all these other things also in the game. And then I can also talk about the Egyptians too, if I wanted to. That would be a really big one and pretty hard. It's a little easier to do these small ones actually because there's so few deities. When it comes to even the Greek one I did already, I split it into 2 videos, but like even then there's so many deities I didn't talk about. And so I'm going to have to do a Hellenic kind of breakdown at some point where I break down all the different groups and dialects of Hellenic and say what deities were maybe from one group or another. Thank you for watching and leave a like, subscribe. See you next time. Bye.